Are you ready to get sweaty?
Yup!
Good, because we're going to look at the top decks in Marvel Snap. We'll cover how they work, their strengths, their weaknesses, and some replacements for commonly owned cards in this installment of Metagame Review. What's up, nerds? So I just want to start this off by mentioning that all the decks we're going to cover here today are actually really solid choices to climb on the ladder right now, with the exception of one deck, which is the deck on screen right here. You love playing it or you love to hate it, it's a lockdown list. It is mislabeled Guardians. It's not really a Guardians deck at all, simply because it has Gamora in there. That ain't all the Guardians, bruh. That's one. The goal here is to scam wins with Storm, Professor X, and Elaheh, and use cards like Dr. Doom and Ms. Marvel to spread your power wide across the board if your lockdown isn't good enough. I would say the main strength of this deck is it's just really balanced. This deck is the Tim Duncan of Marvel Snap.
Why, because I'm corny?
It's got great fundamentals. This is boring, but he wins when he needs to. If you like playing Ryu in Street Fighter, you'll like this deck. I think the main weakness of this list is your overall power output can be a little low if your lockdown stuff doesn't work, and also against hyperlinear decks like Discard, for example. Discard doesn't mind lockdown too much because their Draculas and their Mobiuses can hold down lanes almost by themselves, so your whole like Professor X Storm might not be enough. I don't think any of the other cards are really swappable. Like Iron Lad, maybe you could put in Jessica Jones for Iron Lad, but other than that, I wouldn't really mess with the deck too much. Alright, that's enough of that stupid deck. Hate it. Alright, next up, Discard. One of the reasons I think Discard is so high on this list is it's pretty budget friendly. As long as you have MODOK, I don't think any of these other cards are like pull 4 or 5, right? Yeah, no, I don't think so. The main strength of this deck is its consistent power output. No matter what happens in any given game, your Mobius and your Dracula is probably going to be really huge, and you're going to get a couple of free swarms. On the other hand, that is the main downside of this list. The opponent knows exactly what you're going to do, exactly where your power is going to be, and they can play around that. The only flexible card in this list, in my opinion, is Dawg. Dawg is solid. It's pretty much always a 3/8 in this list, but you can run really whatever you want in that slot, and I don't think you're going to hurt the overall win percentage too much. Alright, next up is the High Evo list, and a little surprising because this isn't your normal High Evo list you think of. The goal of this particular version is to afflict enemy cards with stuff like Scorpion, The Thing, Spider-Woman, and Cyclops, and then get a cheap Abomination and floating energy every turn, therefore making your last turn play in Hulk super big. I think the strength of this deck is the fact that you're shrinking the enemy's cards, but also really all of your cards are pretty high power output for the amount of energy you invest in them. Like Hulk is the biggest 6-drop in the game if you float energy every turn. Cyclops is the best 3-drop in the game if you're floating energy every turn. Ms. Marvel is the highest output 4-drop if you're playing your cards correctly in all the lanes. Its weakness is Luke Cage. That one single card completely hoses you, which is why this list is running Rogue. So as far as replacements go, unknown cards, Rogue, definitely don't replace that. You could put in Man-Thing over Ms. Marvel if you don't have Ms. Marvel, and if I were to do that, I would take out Scorpion and put in your own Luke Cage. Spider-Woman is also flexible. I found that it's not needed whatsoever here. You can just put Man-Thing instead of Spider-Woman, and I think the deck will run perfectly the same. What? Next up, She-Not. Hate that name. It's such a stupid name. It's an Infinite She-Hulk deck. This deck looks to play Magic out on turn 3, 4, or 5, skip turn 6, and then slam down a Giant Hulk or Infinite with a free She-Hulk. I think the strength of this list is that the opponent doesn't know where you're going to be slamming your power at the end of the game. And even if they do, it's still a little tricky for them because your Sunspot's been floating and soaking all this energy, your Cyclops been shrinking their stuff, that even if they know where you're going to put your points, they might not have enough to combat it. The main weakness to this deck is people turning off your magic. And sometimes if you don't draw your Infinite, or your Hulk and She-Hulk, like all three of those in some sort of combination, the deck is pretty awkward. As far as replacements go, I think Shocker and Cyclops are really your only cards you can mess with here. You could put like Nebula instead of Shocker. You could do something else instead of Cyclops, even though Cyclops is pretty solid here. A lot of lists that I see playing on the ladder and stuff sometimes don't have either of those two cards. Leech is not replaceable. Well, I guess if you want to get super cute, you could put Kang in there just to see if your final turn is going to be enough to win, and then you can bail if it's not. Next up, it's Loki. What do I say about this deck? Make Collector big, make Wolf big. Win. Next deck. Next deck is labeled Darkhawk. I think that's sort of a mislabeled deck. I feel like this deck is more of just like a good stuff deck. The goal here is to win lanes with either a Darkhawk or Devil Dino, go wide with your Miss Marvel, maybe copy it with the Mystique, and then close out the game with a Dr. Doom. This deck is sort of like the Guardians deck, and really there's not many weaknesses here other than Enchantress, but there's not really any matchups where you're like super favored either. I think this is the perfect 12 cards for this type of deck. I wouldn't change anything here whatsoever, and if you're looking for something to just ladder with, and you're not really sure what you want to play or how to deal with the given meta at any time, this deck's always a safe choice. Next up is labeled Miss Marvel. It's not a Miss Marvel deck, it's a Sandman deck. And if this is your favorite thing to run on the ladder, you're not my friend. But the goal of this deck is pretty easy. I mean, it's kind of obvious. You play scaling 1-drops with Sunspot and Nebula, you wave or Electro into a Sandman or Professor X, and then you lock out the game with Dr. Dooms and Miss Marvel to spread power, or an Elaheh and Orca to just lock down one particular lane. The strength of this deck is playing against any sort of like bounce type list. It's solid against Loki too, and its weakness is stuff like Shuri. Like they don't care. Oh, like, oh, Sandman, oh no, I only get to play exactly what I wanted to do anyway. So yeah, this deck is a very like, you're gonna crush half the meta and you're gonna actually get crushed by the other half of the meta. So next up is Cerebro, which is surprising because Cerebro is historically bad. But the reason this Cerebro deck is on the list, and because it's actually pretty solid in my opinion, is because you don't rely on Cerebro. The goal here is just to play out good stat cards. Medusa, Lizard, Silk, Polaris, Spider-Man, all good power for the energy you put in. And then you can go wide with Miss Marvel or Dr. Doom, and Cerebro's more like just the cherry on top. Another reason why I think this deck is solid is because there's not really too many weaknesses or strengths. It's just middle of the road. This deck's a Honda Civic. It's not flashy, it'll get the job done. And you're usually going to be pretty happy with it. Although I would say the main weakness of this deck is locations. Anything that makes cards bigger is no fun. But then again, it's not that big of a deal because you're not relying on Cerebro. Replacements for this list, if you don't have Miss Marvel, you could try out Stegron. But really I wouldn't mess with this list too much. I think the Enchantress slot is the only slot I would actually mess around with. Next up is Shuri. It's Shuri. You make thing big, you copy big thing, win game. Moving on. Alright, last deck up is Destroy, which is interesting. I think it's mostly because of all the Annihilus stuff going on in the meta right now. Destroy's really solid against that, and you're like, oh no, a Hood and a Void, whatever will I do? Carnage, Deathlock, thanks GG. I will say I don't like this particular version. It's running Hulkbuster to get really big Deadpools, and I just don't like going all in on one single card like that. I would suggest running America Chavez instead of Hulkbuster to make sure you draw everything in a timely manner, and you always want your free death, so Chavez helps you draw a free death every game. The strength of this deck is the fact that you really stomp on certain decks, like they just can't keep up with your power output. But then again, the weakness of this deck is that sometimes you just get hosed, like bad. If someone plays Armor and Cosmo and they happen to have Professor X, you have no shot of winning that game. None. And also the mirrors are kind of not fun. It's just whoever has their Null and Death in hand will win the mirror. That's it. That's all the decks. That's the metagame right now. I think it's actually a really interesting list. I usually wouldn't see some of these types of decks so high up, but what I think is cool is you could pick a bunch of these decks and even some that are lower on the list and do perfectly fine on the ladder. Yes, lockdown decks and a lockdown meta is slightly annoying, but in all reality, you can do whatever you want and you'll be able to climb. That's it though. Thank you so much for watching. Oh, if you're still here, I put in the comments banana hammock, just so I know who the real cool people are. That's it though. Later on, nerds. Banana hammock.